My name is KARAH Preiss.
I'm Claire.
This is Claire, and she is the author of this wonderful volume called Broadband. What's the subheading? Oh, the untold story of the women who made the internet.
It's kind of like a...
That was well timed, thank you.
See? It's gonna be fine. We had some... It's gonna be fun. Yeah, strong subtitle. That's the kind of thing that publishers really love, like the untold story of something.
It's like a Mad Libs filler.
Yeah.
It's the untold story of blank that will do blank.
It feels like a lot, like it feels like a lot to claim that the book is about. When I was writing it, I would just say that I was writing like a feminist history of the internet, which feels a little bit more appropriate.
Wouldn't you say that a feminist history of the internet is just a history of the internet?
Yeah, sure, right. In a perfect world.
I hope so. So thank you guys for being here. This is awesome. We, as Claire said, we're talking about a book at a film festival, which is what I would like to do, as I run an online book club with Emma Roberts, who's sorry she couldn't be here because she has to work. And so, you know, I also have a podcast about AI because I'm a multifaceted millennial. And you know, you guys know how it is. Yeah. And so actually this book is the perfect intersection of both of my interests, which is technology and reading. So,
I wrote it for you, actually.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I asked Claire to do a little primer of women on and in the business of the internet.
Yes.
And you know, before the internet really in computing, which you'll explain to us. So she's gonna do a little slideshow evolution.
Yes, I'm gonna give you like the most condensed history of women in computing that I can do given the time. It's very easy to get deep in the weeds on this, and if I do, please just cane and pull me by the neck so I can go back. So let's go ahead and pull up that first slide. Okay, so you can kind of start anywhere when you're talking about the history of women in technology. You can start with weaving or these sort of more symbolic interrelationships between patterns and machines and women. But most sort of conventional histories will have it begin with the history of the word computer itself, because for close to 200 years, a computer wasn't a thing, it was a job, like something that people did for a living. So is the word calculator, actually. So for a very long time, before the ascendance of the modern mechanical computer, when complicated mathematical work had to be done to support, you know, emerging scientific progress, it had to be done by human beings. And the best and most efficient way to do that was to get groups of human beings together in interrelated groups and have them crunch numbers simultaneously and check each other's work.
What we're seeing here.
Yes, so there's 4 of these images you can page through. This is the Harvard computers. They were a group of women who worked at Harvard cataloging the stellar data.
I like her. Look at the stink eye.
This is Bletchley Park. This is women, you know, cracking Nazi codes during World War II. You know, the applications of human computing are really diverse. They're as diverse as, you know, the applications of any mathematical project at all, but the thing that human computers all had in common was that, you know, they were all women. And that's not because there was some, like, respect for women's mathematical ability. It was because computing at this level, this kind of, like, tedious arithmetic work, was not considered to be important. It wasn't considered to be like pure mathematics. It wasn't considered to be an academic discipline. It was just kind of like work that you did with your brain, in the same way that like hammering a nail is work that you do with your hands. And you know, a lot of women were working in this industry as like sort of cottage workers at home, or you know, while their men were away at war. So there was this sort of really feminized space. This is of course the Human Computing Lab at NASA, which was so eloquently written about in Margot Lee Shetterly's book, Hidden Figures, and of course the film. Next slide, please. But then around the Second World War, real mechanical computers as we know them today were invented, largely to make the math that these women were doing faster. A lot of the calculations that were being done around this time were ballistics calculations for the war. So, you know, trying to determine what angle you need to shoot a gun at in order for it to land in enemy territory, you have to do differential calculation equations to figure out that. And so there were a lot of women in the early 1940s who were doing this math on a machine called the differential analyzer, which is what you see here, and essentially producing these tables of mathematical formula that were sent to the front. They couldn't do it fast enough.
Was this a precursor to anything we would recognize now?
Not really. This is what's referred to as an analog computer. It's too complicated to get into now, but it's essentially just like an advanced slide ruler. You know, it's not using any sort of electromechanical process. But the women that were doing this work using this machine and also their own minds were the only people who really knew what the mathematical work was to be done on these new mechanical computers that were being put in place to replace them. So they were the ones who were naturally hired to program the new computers because they were just essentially training their replacements, if you will. Of course, like nobody really understood at the time that programming was something important. This is, I was going to say, like, human computers kind of disappeared around the 40s because of this, but the major exception being in aeronautics, because human computers double-checked all the mechanical calculations until the Human Computing Lab at NASA was dissolved in the 70s. So there were still really kind of incredible human computers working both on the mechanical side and also just doing the pure arithmetic until the 70s.
So I'm just thinking about, like, we hear a lot of conversations, there's a lot of think pieces, clickbaity articles now about sort of the end of certain jobs, automating certain jobs. Is this a very good example of jobs being automated?
It is a very good example, but it's also a good example of the fact that when a job is automated, it often creates a new job, you know? I mean,
right.
Programming as a discipline did not exist when mechanical computers were invented, and the early programmers were thought of as being like, essentially secretarial, or like telephone operators, where they're doing this kind of menial manipulation of a machine that wasn't considered to be in of itself important. And it wasn't really until the women that were working in the space developed, workarounds and ways of streamlining the process and ways of kind of automating their own processes and ways of documenting the processes, that it was like, oh, programming is its own thing. Software is something that's completely discrete from hardware that is as important as, if not more important, ultimately, than the development of the hardware itself. So it's like, the human computers were automated out of a job, but then that created this condition for human programmers to sort of define the next 50 years of.
But it's interesting because then that job was then filled by many men, not as many women.
Yes.
Right, so it's a sort of interesting case of women doing this job for a very long time and then it being reinvented and filled by most
Yes,
women.
totally, and that's the thing that happens, has happened so much throughout this history. Women kind of enter in, if you're looking for women in the history of computing, it's the best place to look is at the beginning of things. Because when something is new, there's no precedent, there's no canon, there's no establishment, so you can kind of make your own voice and define that space. But also because that's the period of time where nobody knows what's important, nobody knows what's going to be what you can capitalize on financially, nobody understands the significance of something, so you can kind of make contributions that once they become apparent, then the capitalists arrive, and then the men arrive and are like, oh, we can sell this, or we can streamline this, or we can make this our own, we can sort of reclassify this. There's this really interesting semantic thing that happened in the 60s where, for a long time, this, the work of programming computers was referred to as coding or programming or operating, and it wasn't until the late 60s, early 70s that it started being referred to as software engineering.
Oh.
And that was this very specific intentional semantic change that was made by men at this UN summit in 1968, where they were like, we can't call it this anymore, we have to put it in this new category that has associations of professional accreditation and education that we associate with things that men have access to. You know what I mean? So in order to sort of take it out of the feminine space, it had to be masculinized, and that masculinization happened in both a sort of semantic way and also in a sort of commercial way.
And that's when you ultimately see women having far fewer jobs in this space.
There was this change in the kinds of requirements that were necessary. For a long time, it was a job that you could just do if you were clever and good at math. Secretaries
which
often.
I'm not. It's very casual. I'm not.
I was not. Me neither. Me neither. Which I
seems like a hard job.
Yeah.
Do you want to?
Yeah. Next slide. Well, I can't remember what the sequence of anything is. Oh yeah. So.
Oh gee.
Yeah. So a lot of times when you talk about the history of women in computing, these sort of iconic figures are trotted out, like Ada Lovelace and Grace Hopper. They're the sort of famous women in computing, and they're super interesting, and there's obviously such a hunger for representation in tech that these women are really specifically lionized and made into these kind of one-dimensional heroines. It's Grace Hopper, you'd see the sort of, there's a Grace Hopper conference, and you see Grace Hopper sticker books for kids and t-shirts, and it's very sort of merchandised now, but Grace Hopper was this really fascinating, incredibly complex and deeply troubled person, and one of the things I really wanted to do with this book was make sure that I represented the full depth and complexity of these characters, because tech history is full of real anti-hero male characters. Steve Jobs is a really complicated character who's terrible to his kid. There's all these layers that we can acknowledge that he was a hero and a genius and an asshole at the same time. And I'm not saying Grace Hopper was an asshole, but she definitely had her problems. She was an alcoholic. She was a workaholic. She was really hard on people. There's a lot more going on than just she's a genius. So that's a big part of the book is that.
Yeah, I keep harping on this anecdote about her that you write about, where she happened to have a compact mirror. If you can explain that, I just think it's a good example of solutions that can come about accidentally when women are even in a room.
Yeah, so for context, Grace Hopper was a mathematician. She was a Yale-educated mathematician. She had a PhD in mathematics. And when World War II happened, she really wanted to serve the war effort, as a lot of people did at that time. And she was she went to the Navy, enlisted in the Navy, like went through boot camp, and then was just assigned like a job, not knowing what it was going to be. She was assigned to program this very early mechanical computer called the Harvard Mark I at Harvard, which was another one of these sort of like ballistics calculating machines. And she had like never, there's no manual, you know, like it was the first computer. So she didn't have like, she wasn't an engineer. She didn't know how to do programming because nobody had invented it yet. She was just like brought into this room where like a room-sized, insane, like whirring steel thing full of like miles of cables was just presented to her, and like, you know, the inventor of the Mark II was like, you know, put math on this, basically. And she had to like reverse engineer an engineering education. She had to like learn wiring diagrams and like talk to engineers and sort of deconstruct the machine until she understood like how the hell you put a differential calculus equation on this thing. But she ended up running the programming team throughout the war, and there's like a lot of things I can say about Grace Hopper. She invented compilers. Anyway, but during the war, they would always have these problems where like the wiring relays would spark out and you couldn't find like exactly where the problem was, and nobody figured out how to solve that problem except like she had like a pocket mirror in her purse, and she was able to like go in and be like, oh, this one's fucked up. And that was just like, yeah, this very simple thing that just like probably would not have occurred to a male engineer that was trying to debug this machine, to just like, you know, pull out a compact and look. But she had that tool, yeah. She also very famously like coined the term software bug, not exactly, but like a moth flew into the computer, and there's this really beautiful object that is like from her notebook of like the moth like taped to a page, and it says like first instance of computer bug or something.
It was literally a bug tampering with.
Yeah, like it was like in the lexicon of engineering, like a bug in a machine or a system, but no, like she had like a literal moth that had like shorted out one of the relays, and so she like pulled it out. It's in the archives. It's pretty amazing.
I interrupted you.
Yeah, these are her contemporaries at the University of Pennsylvania, the ENIAC 6, who were the programmers of the first all electronic programmable computer, the ENIAC. And they were really interesting because they were sort of deputized from the human computation lab. They were doing the math, and they were brought into this project. And they were like, they basically invented how to use it. Like none of the engineers had any idea how to actually do software on this thing, and they sort of formalized the methods for doing this, and they got absolutely zero credit for it whatsoever. When this machine was first sort of unveiled to the press after the war, there was this big to-do where they had this like big luncheon, this gala, and all these people came, and the press came, and all the military brass came, and it ran this demonstration, which two of the ENIAC 6, Betty Snyder and Betty Holberton, had spent like 5 weeks creating, and like they had this huge like insurmountable bug, and they didn't like at the 11th hour they fixed it, this whole saga. And then once the demonstration was run, you know, they took photos of everybody, and you know, the women were never pictured in any of the photographs, and they weren't invited to the dinner, they weren't invited to the cocktail hour, they were like never given any credit in any of the histories that were written by the men who worked on the project. And like even in some historical photographs that like the army released, like they were cropped out, or they're credited as being like models. It's just so brutal, but it's just like, that just goes to show how undervalued their work was. Like there was this thinking around the time that like, oh, here's this new miraculous machine, it can do the work of man in 15 seconds or whatever. Like, and it was all this emphasis on the machine, like how the machine can do this, without at all considering the fact that there was like weeks and weeks of labor going into like setting up the machine to do the thing, and that the machine itself is actually like quite stupid. It only knows how to do like ones and zeros. It only knows how to do commands in this like really specific regimented list form.
I mean, it's like, who are the humans in the loop? And if they're women, then we're not so interested, or this time, like if they were women, we're not so interested in talking about humans in the loop.
Yeah, I don't think that like the press and the military and like, you know, the senior academia that they were working under were like ready to acknowledge the level of sophistication in terms of the intellectual labor that was going into this. Like the heroes were the engineers, the heroes were the builders. Like there just like wasn't the thinking to even think of software as something that had value until much later. And like ultimately their stories didn't really get told until these women were like in their 70s and 80s, and they were just so pissed off that they wrote their own autobiographies, you know, and they were like, I did this, goddammit. And that's when sort of history turned around, and now they're, you know, obviously very celebrated, and they're all inducted into various...
Google.
Yeah, oh, you know they're getting their Google doodles.
Like, Ada Lovelace is always, like, I feel like they're always celebrating her on that Google thing.
Yeah, the doodle.
Yeah, the Google doodle.
Okay, next slide, I don't even know.
Oh.
Yeah, so, okay, so after the war, after the war, like all these women had been doing this programming work, and after the war, it became apparent that like computing was going to be something with commercial value. Like we could sell computers to, you know, the aeronautics industry, the insurance industry, any computationally intensive industry would, you know, find use for these machines. And so, curiously enough, like the very first commercial computer companies had all female programming staffs as well, because again, the women are the only people who knew how to do the programming. So, you know, these like sort of the UNIVAC, which was like the big computer of the 1950s, was entirely set up and programmed, like the logical instruction set, like everything was set up and programmed by these teams of women who like ran their own programming teams and like kept their own hours. And again, it wasn't until like the industry got much more sort of sophisticated commercially that these women were pushed out, but they were really doing the work, and it was like pretty normal for women to be in computing for a very long time, like well into the 20th century. This is from 1967, this is an article from Cosmo about like how, you know, working in computing would be like a great alternative to secretarial work. And there's even a quote in this article from Grace Hopper talking about how software engineering programming is like planning dinner parties. You have to plan ahead and schedule everything so it's ready when you need it. Programming requires patience and the ability to handle detail. Women are naturals. So that was the thinking for a long time. Like, this is the kind of stuff that women are really good at. This is a space that women can thrive in and make a living and, you know, make a name for themselves and have some independence. So yeah, like, I mean, this is 1967, so this is like actually sort of the beginning of the end of women in tech in a weird way.
I was about to say to you sort of what happened, which you'll get into, but you know, 1967 up through, I don't know, you don't really see like lions of computing after this time up until quite recent, or like, not quite recently. I mean, there's a number of women that you talk about in your book, but I just feel as though like the visibility wasn't there for a while after.
It's a confluence of a lot of things, you know, there's never like a clear reason why this happens. I mean, I don't know, it's funny, I give talks about this book all the time, and people will always come after me afterwards and be like, it's so crazy, the same thing happened in film, or the same thing happened in medicine, the same thing happened in like video art. And it's like, yeah, like we all recognize these patterns where if something is sort of interesting commercially, or something has status that is sort of developed over time, like it becomes interesting to men in a new way, and like there's not like one guy who's like, this is for me now. It's like this slow, congruent.
Well, it reminds me of the weed industry, actually.
Yeah, totally. It's this like confluence of a lot of things.
Who gets to make money on weed?
Yeah,
sort of thing.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
That's another conversation.
But yeah, like these patterns are really obvious to I think most women.
I do love these photos, even if I don't know if they're controversial, but I have seen these photos before and I do love them.
Yeah, I mean, this is just like to give you some flavor of like how normal it was for women to be in this environment. This is a Bell Labs like database center in Oakland in the 70s. And these women were all like mostly doing data entry, but you know, it's like very normal for women to just be in these kinds of environments, to be in tech. Like this idea that tech is some kind of boys' club is really an anachronism. But to be fair, like the work that these women are doing is probably less sort of high level than it would have been even like 10 years previous. They're probably doing data entry or key punch entry, which is kind of like where women in software engineering and programming kind of ended up in the 60s and 70s. Like they were still in computing, but they were doing, you know, this sort of more like lower status, they were like being pushed in the lower status side of things. They were starting to do data entry. They weren't like writing, you know, programming languages or compilers anymore. They were doing the more kind of menial work. Next slides, please. Just more of these like fabulous outfits. I don't know, I mean.
No, they're pretty cool.
Like when I saw these photos, I was just so delighted. Like how beautiful and full of life this environment must have been. Like how lovely to just be working with all of your fabulous female coworkers and everyone's wearing these like beautiful, colorful psychedelic dresses and the neat little beehives and little shoes. Like it's just lovely, you know? Like I want this to be the feeling, I want this to be like the image of what it is to work in tech today, but obviously.
And it's so, I mean, that's what was striking to me about your book, is that for me it so isn't, when I think about, because when I think about the tech industry, I think about what I think a lot of people think about, which is, you know, sort of, as you've said, like garages, you know, jobs, gates, hoodies, Atari, even Atari, like
snacks,
gaming,
like so many snacks.
Well, snacks are the thing now.
Like pop chips?
Yeah, pop chips was invented in Silicon Valley. I
mean, maybe.
But yeah, you know, I think it's important. Oh, here's Stacey Horn, who's a bad bitch. She'll talk about her.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, we can move through this quickly.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the thing about my book is like it covers this space from, you know, early computing through the 1970s, and then there's like this thing that happens that is the internet, which is a really sort of completely came from out of left field and was sort of adapted and discovered by many different people across different sort of spectrums of life. And I think what's interesting about the web and the internet is that it allowed people who are not technical to get involved and engaged with the process of making technological objects. So my book is full of like people that were sort of on the user side or the content side, you know, game developers and community builders and people who were making like early multimedia experiences for the web. Like I think all these people are as important to a history of technology as people who make software or people who build boxes, you know, like these are the people that give meaning and substance to the actual act of interfacing with computers. These are the people that create the experiences that like actually move us and actually make us feel things. So that's something that I think is also like really undervalued in this history and tech history in general, because it's so easy to like point at a Mac classic and be like, look at this box, changed the world, you know, and like, and that has physical presence. Like there are landfills filled with, you know, obsolescent
As we were talking
machines. Well, like software is so much more ephemeral, and like media and community, these things are super, super important, but they're so much harder to quantify, and they're so much harder to like think of as being historic or historicized. So yeah, I mean, this is a woman, Stacey Horn, who started like a very, very early online community in the 90s called Echo. This is Wendy Hall, who was a hypertext designer. So there's like all these people that were operating in this space that was sort of not privileged as being technical, but ultimately actually really, really was. That's kind of the main point I want to make with these slides. We can get into hypertext if we want. Again, this is like very in the weeds, so I don't want to get too much into it. Next slide.
We'll get there.
There's a latency. It's a technical term.
All right, it's fine.
It's fine. Okay.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah. So okay, this is like a little bit about like in terms of what happened. Like, so I grew up in the '90s. I guess I'm a millennial.
I'm a millennial.
Is that weird to ask?
No, are we allowed to ask? Two women are allowed to ask. I'm 30. Yeah. So y'all, who did people remember their first computer? Sorry, I don't know if this is like it, right? You remember your first computer? It's like your first kiss. I mean, for me, I don't because that's how memorable it was.
Same. Same.
But you know, I think we were talking about this. It's like the experience of having a computer growing up was like. To me now, I don't think about, ooh, which laptop do I have? You know, I'm like, you get the one that Apple's making.
Yeah.
Whereas when I was young, it was a piece of furniture in my house.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but what's interesting and what I really thought about a lot reading your book is like, there was no thought for me, and maybe it's because I was like 5 and through 10, but there was no thought for me in terms of like what went into developing these products.
Oh yeah, no.
I was like, this is for me to play, you know, kid pics, cool pics,
kid pics,
and
Missed.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, totally. You don't think about that when you're a kid. You're just like, here's the thing. Like, here's the thing that's gonna like, I don't know. I mean, I really like. I never thought the computer was for boys or for girls either.
I didn't either.
Like, I was never. For me, it was like, oh, like, is the toaster for boys or for like? It's just like a thing in your house. You know, it doesn't have gender. It doesn't have like. It doesn't have any like priorities about who's supposed to be using it.
Well, but that's what's so interesting is. In the latter part of your book, when you start talking about users, focusing on users versus developers, say, you really realize that like female users are so important to the formulation and foundation of what we now know as the internet, and also just like women talking to one another was so important at the foundation of the internet, and now and up through now, I guess. I don't know then how the tech business is still considered so male-centric. I guess that's two different things that we're talking about.
That's a woman I interviewed for my book named Kathy Marshall, who was like a hypertext designer at Xerox PARC in the 70s and 80s, and she told me like...
Xerox is the photocopier. Just as a...
She told me that like computer science has always marginalized people who are interested in users, because it's considered to be like, it's not tech, people aren't tech, you know, like you can't create technological solutions to human problems, although we try all the time, but like it's not considered to be a technical track job to be like a UX designer or to be someone who's doing community building in social space or to moderation. You know, these jobs are considered to be like human-centric jobs and therefore softer and like less important and less technical. And I don't know that's a consequence of, you know, the way that money is made in this industry, I think. But those are such important. Every single one of those jobs is so important, and my book is full of people who are working in those spaces because it's like, yeah, that's like actually that's technology. Mm-hmm. That's what technology is for. Mm-hmm. We're supposed to be for. Yeah. You can go to the next slide. This is just like this really fucked up Apple ad from the 70s that kind of like. Yeah, exactly. So if you ever like want to go on like a depressing bender, just like research, just look up like vintage computer ads. Like it's all this. It's all like either like a man with a business suitcase in front of a thing, or it's like a really sexy woman like posing on top of a mainframe. There's no like imagery of female users at all, especially in the 70s. Like when personal computers were sort of beginning to appear on the marketplace, it was always like, you know, the woman watching lovingly while the man does his like whatever
he's doing.
graphs.
Yeah.
You can give me the next slide. But yeah, and then there's like these things where like that kind of thinking even percolates like into the design of hardware. So this is something called the Honeywell kitchen computer. That was,
Was this an actual
This was real.
device?
This was sold in the Montgomery Ward catalog winter 1978, I think. It's like actually like a quite sophisticated computer. Like the brain of this computer is like the foundation of the internet in the sense that like these Honeywell machines were repurposed and became routers. Anyway, again, weeds. But this computer like took like 6 weeks of programming classes to learn how to use. It cost $20,000, but it was marketed to women as being like this thing that you could use to like get your recipes straight in the kitchen and like manage your household budgets. So that's like how condescending the imagery and the marketing and just like the position of the computing industry was in regards to women for a really, really long time.
Her face is very like, now what do we have here?
Like, you know, like buying a $20,000 computer and
Yeah.
being like, I'm gonna slice zucchini on top of
Yeah.
this. Like, who would ever do that? Actually, I think like, I mean, this is like very outrageous. I don't think any of these was actually, I think maybe one was ever sold. Like, it was obviously like not a good product. One of the many tragic projects. Next slide. But the most condescending thing about this ad is the language around this. If only she can cook as well as Honeywell can compute. Fuck you know? Like, in her own home, she's being insulted. But yeah, I mean, I grew up in the 80s, so like this kind of stuff was not around by that time. But like I grew up with movies like Weird Science, you know, where like boys are programming their dream woman, and like, you know, computer games are mostly targeted towards young boys. You know, like all that stuff. We think of it as being the sort of fluff because it's pop cultural, but like that stuff permeates our thinking about what technology is for and who technology is for in a way that is like undeniable, right? And it has like obviously influenced an entire generation of people into feeling like entitled to a space that is not historically necessarily even theirs, you know?
Yeah, exactly. Oh,
yeah, just to rub it in. She'll learn to program her favorite recipes. It's like, oh my god.
are we going
Also, like, what recipes need programming?
But also that they're trying to sell a cookbook in the same, they're also talking about data in the same sentence as cookbook. The description is very strange to me.
Yeah, anyway. I think this is actually the last slide.
Oh, it's the last slide.
I mean, try it. Let's see. Let's find out. I think it is. Yeah, it is.
There we go. Broadband.
So that's like the most broad strokes history of computing. I skipped so much stuff, and we can talk about other things.
Well, so this book, I mean, I've highly suggested to everyone just because I think my conception of how the internet came to be and how the computer as we know it today came to be was, I mean, I never really thought about it before, even though I have a technology podcast, but the podcast that I do it's called Sleepwalkers, and it's way more about artificial intelligence, which of course plays into all of this, but I don't really think about the sort of foundations of the internet all that much, even though I probably should. The thing that I'm sort of interested in, for the sake of, I think, because I started an online reading community and people will often be like, well, what's that? Is it a book club, or is it a, and I'm like, well, the internet is an amazing space to discuss things, especially discuss things that like are often presented as obsolete or feared, you know, or less popular. And unfortunately, I don't know how books became that category, but they have. So I guess my question for you is, you know, you talk in the book about this, and I think you do it in a really interesting way. Like, how did the internet go from being community-driven to commodity-driven, and also like making communities commodities, which is not something originally that they were. It was like the early internet was very pure.
Well, in a way, I mean, it was also like funded by the military.
That's true. That's true. Forget about DARPA. Yeah.
There's no like innocent history. It definitely was more simple originally, but initially because like the internet was never designed to even be a community technology. It was originally designed to be like a way for computer scientists to like access computing resources without having to like take their magnetic tape in a briefcase and get on an airplane and like go to MIT. Like it was a way to make, you know, doing research easier. It's just the problem is like as soon as you connect two computers together, like throughout the history, people just immediately use it to like hang out.
The Garden of Eden.
Yeah, like people just use it for social purposes right out of the gate. Like it became transformed into a communications medium almost instantaneously. Like all the people that were building the early internet were just like,
Is there evidence of like the first computer? I'm not trying to put you on the spot. I mean, I don't. Like,
Try to stump me.
Is there evidence of like the first like P2P communication, like computer to computer communication?
Yeah, well, it's funny because this history is like, it's not super linear. Like we think about the internet as being something that arrived and then all of a sudden it was connected, social space. But there were all these other things like bulletin board systems and like online services that were accessed in these different ways. Like, so it's not super clear. There's like a sort of general strokes. But I mean, there's like this incredibly sort of iconic history of computing story about like the first two nodes of the ARPANET being connected, and these like UCLA and Stanford were connected, and they were trying to just transmit like just one word, which was login, but then it crashed after LO, so the first message was just low, which is kind of beautiful and has been sort of written about very beautifully in a lot of tech histories, in the Werner Herzog movie about the history of the internet as well.
Right. What is that called?
That's why I said that, because I can't remember what it's called.
I don't know if anyone's seen it. I didn't see it.
It's
but
quite
I hear
good.
It's very good.
It's quite good. I mean, it sort of privileges people that have been not in terms of like women or people of color, but it privileges like some weirdo peripheral members of the history that I've always had a fondness for, that have kind of been written out of the history, like this guy Ted Nelson, who's like a complete wonderful genius kook, vaporware guy who had these amazing ideas about what the web should be for, and have never come to fruition, but he gets his moment in that film.
I interrupted you a little bit. You were talking about sort of how early communities formed, and I guess sort of the female user's role in those communities. I'm thinking specifically like about women.com. I mean, the fact that there was a website called women.com, like all-encompassing.
There still is. It's just something else now. That's the funny thing about like web history in general, is that like URLs are valuable real estate. So like you can't build a memorial to a website because it's just going to get bought and replaced by something else. Right. Which is why the Wayback Machine is so amazing. But yeah, I mean,
the Wayback. Do you guys know about the Wayback Machine? Yeah, it's a very, 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 very strange. The Wayback Machine. It's unbelievable. I'm just saying because I know that a lot of my friends have been like, what the fuck is that?
Yeah, it's a tool that was built by the Internet Archive, and they started essentially like crawling the web in 1993, or just like archiving websites, and now it's a, incomplete and fractured history of, you can basically go to any URL and like dial backwards and see like,
you can like see what it looked like at a specific time.
Yeah, it's super fascinating.
Cool. It's very cool.
Yeah, not all of the content is preserved, but most of the text and the structures. It's like, I would have been impossible for me to write my book without it. Like, it's this incredible tool. And like, such a prescient tool to like know that it would be important to preserve this material. Yeah. It's very sort of slippery history. Anyway, communities.
And communities into commodities, I was talking about.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very apt question, because I feel like that's kind of the central problem of the modern internet, is this, we're still kind of holding on to the dream of the 90s that the internet is essentially a community technology.
And it's sort of what you hear from on the venture capital side, where it's like, you need the community first, and then, blah, blah, blah.
Like, no one cares less about communities than venture capitalists. Like, but yeah, I mean, yeah, so like, we have this ongoing sort of delusion that the internet is a community technology, because that was such a potent metaphor, such a potent myth in the 90s. Like, it was such a big part of the way we talked about and wrote about the internet. There was so much sort of cyber-cultural writing and pop culture that was revolved around this idea that like the internet is for community. And like our social media platforms that we all operate within now have sort of grafted themselves onto that assumption and like held on to it as a sort of shield for more nefarious activity, and to sort of conceal from us the reality of the fact that the internet is absolutely like a consumer technology.
It's one big spawn con.
Yeah, like,
or ad-supported.
Because if you look at like early internet communities, like those people were stakeholders in their own communities. Like, they got to determine the rules of those communities. If people violated those rules, they could kick them out. They developed their own social conventions, their own language, because that's what happens when people get together in small enough groups. Like, you develop an identity that is sort of like almost place-based. Like, it almost feels physical in that sense. And we obviously don't have that now. Like, we are not stakeholders in our own communities. We don't have any say in how like Facebook is designed and works. Or it's incredibly opaque. And we don't know where our posts go. We don't know why posts get deleted. We don't know who's moderating.
We don't know how to delete. I mean, it's very hard to also
delete.
We can't.
Nothing is ever being deleted. So we have no agency. It's not community. Like, to me, community is something that is collectively defined by individuals who are like vested stakeholders in a place or in a subculture or something.
And I'm forgetting her name right now, but there was a woman who was involved in women.com who really had come from a background of like understanding what a true commune was, and bringing that to the internet.
That's a super fascinating thing about early internet history, is that like a lot of people that were working in the Bay Area and sort of foundational to the development of really internet communities were actually coming out of like the Back to the Land movement in the 70s. Like they were leaving their communes and moving to the Bay Area and like starting what they thought were going to be like virtual communes. And some of the earliest moderators of like the earliest online communities were like people who had been living, you know, in like radical social experiments. So that was like infused in some of the DNA and the structure of some of those spaces. But then like that, it sort of mutated into the sort of the, you know, the dot-com bubble, when all of a sudden there was this hysterical accumulation of wealth and this like great desire to try to figure out how to monetize this incredibly like unmonetizable thing that is human communities.
And I think what's so depressing to me when I think of, well, because I would assume that a lot of people here spend time on Instagram, and probably spend a lot of time on Instagram, probably spend time that they don't want to be spending on Instagram. But when I use Instagram, it feels very, well, it feels kind of pure. I mean, just like, the joy I get from it is sort of is fabricated. But my point is that like, I don't, in my daily life, think about the sort of sinister apparatus that is like a company, Facebook, owning my communication.
That's because you're a user. You're beautiful.
That's because I'm a beautiful user. Yeah. I mean, I guess like, how do we get? Is there a way to get technology companies to return? They pretend that they're returning back to being users, but yeah, it's not gonna.
I mean, I think the best we can do is like use things in spite of what they are doing to us. You know, I think there is like. I mean, as dystopian as our social media landscape is, like there are still so many beautiful people using it to do beautiful things, to start fucking book clubs, for example,
right.
or you know, to like amplify the voices of the marginalized, or to do activism, or to, you know, like create new opportunities for themselves. Like there's a lot of beautiful stuff that continues to happen, but that's not because necessarily like Instagram is making decisions that benefit us. It's us making decisions that benefit us in spite of the parameters that are set in place. And it's us constantly doing this sort of shadow box in terms of trying to figure out how to like make something work for us that isn't trying to work for us necessarily. We always bring the best things to the table. Like all of the like, you know, hashtags and @replies, like those are all invented by users, and Twitter just implemented them. You know, we can never underestimate like the beautiful ingenuity of users to do great things with, you know, whatever, with what we have.
Right.
But I don't trust the like major tech companies to create more spaces for us. I just trust us to do the best that we can. You know, like the street makes its own use for things, as Bruce Sterling would have said. Yeah.
So I have like a more personal question for you. You're also in a band.
Yeah.
And your band is called Yacht.
Oh, that's nice.
But it stands for
Young Americans Challenging High Technology.
Where did I don't know if everybody who listens to Yacht knows that, but I listened to your music and I didn't know it stood for that. But I guess clearly both things, music and technology, are part of your DNA. Where did you come up with that name, and sort of, is it a project, like an ongoing project as far as like a mission?
The name predates me, actually. My partner, bandmate, and life partner, Jonna, who's sitting in the back of the room.
Yeah, give it up.
Hi, honey. He actually named the band in 2001, after this like really weird sign that he saw on the street in Portland, Oregon, for like what we think is like some kind of like after-school center. Just said Yacht, Young Americans Challenging High Technology, and he saw it and he was like, I want my computer music band to be named this. and I love it, but it's also one of those things where like for years people are always like, Yacht sails into town, you know, like there's a lot of that we have to deal with, and it's unfortunate to be associated with like a symbol of luxury capitalism, but but it like, but I do think that the acronym like truly does represent what we do, like what we try to do, which is like find ways of creating narratives within the existing tech ecosystem that are like compelling and user-centric. I think like when you're doing music, like you're thinking about your audience, you're thinking about your community, you're thinking about like all the people that you get to meet along the way. Like that is to me like the beautiful thing about the internet, the beautiful thing about music. And like trying to find ways to like subvert the tools that are available to do weird stuff with. Like we're always trying to use consumer level technologies in like sideways ways that help us propagate our music and our message that aren't necessarily like the prescribed uses of those things. You know, like we do a lot of keynote presentations during the live show, for example. You know, like trying to like take things out of their intended context.
Mixed media, so to speak.
And sort of challenge them, if you will.
And you're doing the thing that I guess you've most recently done in the press is sort of use I say AI very loosely, because I mean, my whole thing is that the fact that the press generally mismanages the term artificial intelligence.
Lord,
It's like, someone said this to me, it's like, artificial intelligence is like color TV. Like when they used to promote TVs as color TVs, nobody would ever now say in living color about a television. Like there will be a future where AI will be just implied. It won't be like it's a marketing tool now in a lot of ways.
I love that we're starting the AI conversation with 5 minutes left. Let's just tackle this. Let's
Well, no,
get
I
into
just want to
this.
talk about one very specific thing, which is how you've used it to create an album.
Yeah, okay, I mean, this is 5 minutes and 10 seconds, thank you.
Okay.
Amazing. Well, I think for us, we were really interested in like the reflective qualities of AI. I mean, well, two things. One, we wanted to understand it, and I think that like as artists and as a writer, like the only way I've ever understood anything is by trying to do something with it or through it. So it was like, oh, we're never gonna get this unless we try to make something with it. And then the other thing was, you know, the way that machine learning works is like you have to train algorithms with like these massive data sets, and those data sets are essentially historic data sets. Like they're like, you know, millions of notes from the history of music or millions of images of faces from Renaissance paintings or whatever it is that you're doing. And so there's this like wonderful opportunity to be reflective about your own history and your own community and your past. And we thought that that was really interesting because we've been a band for a super long time and we've had our ups and our downs, more recently downs than ups. And so we were like, what can we do to kind of reinterrogate who we are and like understand who we are in a way that is like genuinely creative and also provides like interesting new constraints for art making. So, I mean, that's kind of like the short answer.
What did you find in doing this?
Love it. No, yeah, no, it definitely, it did do that. It helped us with that. I think what was the most compelling was trying to find like a human process through like a very opaque, somewhat like, I don't know, like incomprehensible technology that is not at all yet at the point where it's like at a consumer level at all. Like,
so the data
we're not
you were
coders.
feeding, for example,
Yeah.
was what exactly? Was it music that you had made, like?
Yeah, there's a bunch of pieces to it, but let's talk about lyrics, for example.
Yeah.
Like, we built with a collaborator named Ross Goodwin, who's this really amazing, like,
He's a
gonzo
cool guy.
hacker poet guy.
Yeah.
We gave him a corpus of 2.2 million words, and those words were lyrics from our own songs, things that we had written, lyrics by our favorite bands, by the music, like the lyrics and music like our parents listened to and we grew up listening to, music from our immediate community, just like this big sort of database representation of everything that goes into who we are when we sit down to write songs. And then the algorithm sort of replicated the songwriting process by kind of recombining and scrambling and giving us something new out of that. Like, basically we taught an algorithm language only from our favorite songs, you know? So now it wrote us new songs. But like, it didn't, whatever. It wrote us like 20,000 word text that we then like had to go through and pick and choose in a sort of William Burroughs-esque
Well, it still
cut
doesn't
up.
possess creativity.
No,
An algorithm doesn't possess creativity.
No,
Yeah.
they just generate, like, I mean, algorithms just generate. They generate, they like taxonomize, they sort, they assemble, but they don't have creativity. Like, that's what we bring to the table. That's like the humans in the loop once again, you know? It's like finding a way to get in and make something interesting of it, make something meaningful of it, and like discover something about yourself in the process.
Yeah, and I think it's also just really interesting to think about dataizing yourself, right? Where, you know, you have, I think what's so interesting to me about training an algorithm is you can essentially train a computer to know the things that you have liked historically and the things that you've made historically, but you can't yet make that computer act as you would act knowing the things that it does yet, I think. But
I mean, thank God, right?
Right.
No, I say this a lot, but I feel like, you know, in a world in which climate change is, you know, an impending reality, like I don't like believe in the future anymore. Like I don't think about the future as this like realm of possibility. I think the future is short and the past is infinite, which is why I've always been interested in history. And why I'm kind of interested in like this aspect of AI. Like I don't like thinking about AI as like a futuristic technology.
Right.
I think of it as like this like strange mirror by which we can like make sense of how we got to where we are now.
I completely agree.
Which is like what we need, you know.
Because this is a film festival, lest you forget, are there films, television shows, other texts that you have loved that sort of play in the subject of technology or the internet? Like, I was just thinking of that, what was that movie with Josh Jackson? Oh, Hackers. Sorry, are there movies that you have loved?
I mean, I love Hackers,
I love
for
Hackers.
very different reasons. I love Hackers for fashion reasons.
Are there, you know, television films that you've loved that deal
I mean,
with
we
technology?
can, yes. Obviously, *Halt and Catch Fire*. If you haven't watched that show, you are just get ready to love something so much. That's to me like the only contemporary representation of the history of technology that is even remotely interesting, frankly.
Oh, wow.
You know, whatever, like
And
like
it's
a Steve Jobs movie,
right.
like I don't care. It's just like more about the actual process of
Yes.
making things in a way that feels real to me. Closing remarks. Okay. Yeah, that's it. I'm just gonna say that. I'm just gonna halt out.
She loves *Halt and Catch
I
Fire*.
love *Halt and Catch Fire*, yeah.
You don't like AI, artificial intelligence, by Steven Spielberg?
Only the last 3 minutes.
I don't. Okay.
I'm just kidding.
Well, thank you guys for listening to us like babble on about the internet and technology. This is an incredible book. It's called Broadband. If you have any interest in understanding women's roles in technology, dating as far back as I can conceive, you should read this book. And I really appreciate you talking to me today.
Thank you. Right, it's great. Yeah, those are my socials.
Oh, those are her socials.
Don't worry, my socials
Not
are
her
there.
it's a new social security.
I guess we sort of like shot ourselves in the foot in terms of Q&A, but if you have any questions, we can just talk afterwards too. I don't know.
Oh.
I think we had to make room
Should
for
we
Courtney
do-
Love.
Yeah, but you could people can go up to you afterwards
Yeah,
and
I'll
talk
just be in the
about
lobby.
cyberpunk and.
I'll be in the lobby.
Okay, do you want a question? Okay, yeah, ask a question.
Question, I'm sorry if it's strange.
No, I love it already.
But I'm
She wrote it
wondering
down.
if you have a philosophical or kind of metaphysical definition of the internet.
Oh, that's a
What
good
the
question.
internet
That's a
is.
good question. Oh, hold on, let me get my video.
Spiritual, I don't know, whatever, abstract, something.
Wow, that's heavy. Are you like making a zine or something? You should.
Put it on a floppy disk if you do, and send the floppy disk by mail.
I think it's like an incomplete map of human territory, I guess. Like it's an incomplete like index of who we are. It's the most complete up until this point, but it will never be complete because we are constantly regenerating. I don't know if that's spiritual.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on censorship of the female body in particular, especially on platforms like Instagram, where it just seems so strange that they're so offended by like a nipple on a woman? Do you have any insight as to why that might be?
I mean, it is that way because those platforms were built by monocultural groups of prudish men, right? I mean, like it's not. I don't think it's like some great mystery why there's censorship of female nipples. It hurts the bottom line probably in some way that we don't see, but affects like being able to sell ads or something. Like it's some like cynical, gross thing. At the end of the day, though, like I don't know. My relationship to Instagram is so complicated, and as much as I don't want censorship of the female nipple, I also like fear the kinds of exploitation that are inherent in a platform like that. If female bodies are, you know what I mean? Like, what forms of exploitation of women have yet to be imagined by platforms that are like okay with nipples, you know?
Well, and also you think about the fact that there are sex trafficking rings that operate on social media platforms. So but it's complicated too. I mean, you want on one end. You want there to be.
This is the thing. This is like the consequence of scale. I think you know,
Yeah.
like it's very difficult to create, to moderate groups of people in the billions. You can't create rules for people that work across the board for billions of people all around the world, because there's always going to be like cultural, subcultural, regional. There's going to be these nuances that are just impossible to capture. There's going to be these situations where like tech companies maybe like ostensibly want to limit sex trafficking on their platforms, but then the consequence of that is that they censor women's bodies. Like that's big. That's not because of some like ill will or intention. It's just because like you just can't make a thing that serves everybody. You just can't, like at that scale. We're much better served, I think, by like much smaller. I mean, this doesn't exist, but like much smaller kinds of platforms that are more specific to our needs and tailored to us and built by us, ideally.
Niche. I think like niches are popular right now, though. It's even just if you look at food categories, like the amount of craft beer you can buy or the amount of craft coffee you can buy. So I do think this idea of like making something for everybody is not really something we should be striving towards. I mean, I think we should be inclusive, but I think making something for everybody is a really.
And we just get into lowest common denominator territory. Like it's really difficult to make something that works for everybody, and in doing so, you make something that like kind of serves everybody shittily in the same way.
Like Fast and the Furious 8.
An iconic
film festival. One more question. Yeah, in the back.
Yeah, so we know that women have always been present in terms of like machine
I think it can be both, right? I mean, I think it is nice to see the female eye sometimes, but I just don't only want to see it like fetishized or capitalized upon in some specific way. You know, I think it's meaningful to create opportunities, platforms, whatever, that allow for a multitude of forms of expression. And like some women are really interested in, you know, speaking to a more sort of like traditionally feminized perspective or experience, and some women aren't, and there should be space for both of those things. I'm always like really suspicious when, you know, we try to capitalize on this idea of oh, well, women, like, oh, you know, women in tech, I think are like, it's like a very big struggle, I think, right now for women in tech, because they're just like, you know, whatever, like, there's all these platitudes and no real action, you know.
Any other questions? Cool. Well, thank you so much for talking about your book.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us, guys.
Thanks, guys.